Good afternoon, and I'm joined by Hal Shurtleff. He's the director of Camp Constitution, a Boston activist, a constitutionalist. Hal, thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me on, Chuck. It's an honor.
Hal, let's first of all, before we get into a talk about the constitutional mindset, is what I'm calling it, I'd like you to give a thumbnail on what Camp Constitution is doing these days and how people can reach you.
Well, Camp Constitution is a charitable trust set up in 2009. We have a number of things. We run a summer camp, and I think you might see it in reverse, but the sign on the back here has the dates. This year is in the Berkshire of Massachusetts, August 5th to the 11th. We have a YouTube channel. We have a speakers bureau. We have information tables at various venues throughout the year. We testify at state houses on certain issues. We'll be going up to New Hampshire in a few days to testify against this Article 5 convention, which is unfortunately being promoted. And we also make constitutions available to people. One of the things, in fact, we just got an offer to sponsor New Hampshire, Manchester, New Hampshire, the 8th grade of their public school. We're going to be going up there and donating 1,000+ constitutions. And we hope not just the constitutions, but some classes that go along with it, because anybody can have one of these, but if you don't really understand what's inside and use it, then it's not that effective. So you can visit us on our website, campconstitution.net. And we also have something that's very unique. And of course, I know it's near and dear to your heart, the Sam Blumenfeld Archives. And last year, we got over 2 million views of the various things, Sam's newsletters, his writings, his speeches. We've got about 2 or 3 weeks worth of speeches, either audio or video. Some of his books that are available as a free download. And 75,000 people downloaded copies of his Alpha Phonics last year. So we're very proud of that.
No, I mean, I'm very proud to say that I was a good friend of Sam's, and that Sam and I did really hundreds of I think, priceless hours of radio broadcasting together. That, I mean, the kind of stuff that, if we had been on the right side of the culture, as it were, we would have been huge. We would have been, yeah.
There's something very fascinating going through Sam's letters. He was a friend of Victor Lasky, the Republican conservative author of a number of books, but Sam took the narrow road. He fell out of favor with Victor, and Sam took the narrow road because he believed the stuff wasn't just ideology, that it was happening by plan, and Lasky didn't want to embrace that. So I have a letter and it's up on our where Lasky basically said, you can't use my stuff anymore, you can't use my resources. So Sam would have been a household name. He would have been on all the neocon talk shows had he taken a different approach. But as the Old New Testament says, you take the narrow road, the road less traveled, and that's the way. It's what he did.
That's right, and I think that it's safe to say that in spite of the censorship that Sam confronted, he made a huge difference. His life made a huge difference, and I mean that in the literal, tangible sense. In that, I think it's safe to say that Sam Blumenfeld was the catalyst, if not the founder, of the homeschooling movement. He traveled around the world promoting it. He wrote the books that are the Bible of it, and he launched a movement that really countered the whole rotten public school system.
Well, you're right. Sam is definitely a pioneer in the homeschool movement and a hero. It was interesting, too. He never realized the impact he had. And on his deathbed, I know you visited him where he was staying in Waltham at a friend's home, and he was very comfortable. I said, Sam, we're going to do our utmost to make sure your legacy will go on to affect generations yet unborn. And he was glad to hear that, because you look at after looking at years of, say, was my life worth it? Well, Sam led a very worthy life and a very important life, and his impact, there are a lot of people that he'll influence, and they don't even know that Sam was the influence.
That's right. And his books are all available. You've got the Sam Blumenfeld Institute. I have archived Sam's programs on my, website, and you could get them there and in a bunch of other places. Now, Hal, I want to talk a little bit about the centerpiece of your work at Camp Constitution, which is educating young people about the U.S. Constitution. And, the first thing we should note is that the Constitution is very simple and easy to read. A high school student can sit down and read that document and understand it. It's clear, it's concise. It's not like, some of the bills that Congress debates now where you have 1,000 pages. It's right up there. And to understand it in simple terms is a very transformative thing in terms of how you look at politics, how you look at the world, how you look at events going on in public life. You begin to look at it in a context of, is this constitutional? And if so, why? Is this unconstitutional? And if so, why? And, the left wing likes to wave the Constitution around whenever it suits their purpose. We had this guy, Khazar Khan, during the Democratic National Convention, wave the Constitution sanctimoniously in the air while he claimed that candidate Trump somehow didn't understand it. It was the most smug and sanctimonious thing I've ever seen, without really saying exactly what he meant. I mean, what was it precisely? Apparently he thinks that there's something constitutional about mass migration of Muslims into the United States. But if you understand the Constitution and you read it, you realize it says nothing about that. There's no codicil in the Constitution that grants anyone the right to come into this sovereign country.
That's correct.
And in fact, the principle is one of international law and custom, and it's one of common sense. Any sovereign nation has the right, inherently, its natural right, to decide who enters the national home. And, this gets me to also what we might call the preamble to the Constitution, which is, of course, the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence has in it the sort of the philosophy of the United States. And, the most important sentence in that document is that rights come from the Creator and not from the state, and that rights are inalienable. They are the Constitution, which came about 10 or 15 years later. It didn't grant rights. It basically recognized natural rights. It recognized rights that exist in nature. These are rights that even the animal kingdom understands, like property, like borders, like, you want to mess around with the borders of a beaver's dam. I mean, do you want to mess around with the borders of a dog? You get your hand bitten off. Animals understand this.
If you own a dog, try to grab his food out of his dish while he's eating and see what happens.
That's right. Or go into a bird's nest with his, eggs.
That's right.
The animal, this is a natural right. The idea of borders, the idea of sovereignty, this is something that exists in nature. And all the Constitution does is establish it in writing. And even the founders, the Anti-Federalists, understood the dangers of putting something in writing, because when you do that, by nature, you're almost, taking it away from nature and perhaps in some way limiting it. But they went ahead and did that anyway, thank God, and gave us a framework by which we can understand that which is inherent, that which is inalienable, which is our natural rights.
Well, James Madison, who was known as the father of the Constitution, sort of summed it up. Because there was a lot of people who were a little concerned, hey, you were supposed to have a convention and just sort of revamp the Articles of Confederation. You gave us a new one, and we're concerned that there's too much power at the federal level. And Madison said something to the effect that the powers that are given to the federal entity are few and defined. Everything else is left to the states. And that's the basic philosophy. So where do we find the powers? Well, the first three articles: powers that are given to Congress, the House and the Senate, the powers given to the presidency, and the few powers and duties of the Supreme Court. And if you look at the Bill of Rights, you look at the 9th and 10th Amendments, and you can sum it up. If we forgot anything, we can't. The government can't do that either. So certain people were worried that, well, if you list the rights or the powers, that means the ones that aren't listed we don't have. No, they remain to the states. Those that aren't defined are left to the states. I have a book from 1941 published by the U.S. government. It was a celebration of it was called the Formation of the Union under the Constitution. It was a big tome of a book. I paid $1 for it. And it was written by the New Deal Democrats. So it has to be true, right? It has to be true.
Of course.
Right? Franklin Roosevelt put his signature on it. Saul Bloom from New York State put his, so it has to be true.
Right.
They had a series of questions, and they asked the question, what role does the federal government have in education? And the answer was the right one. None. Period.
That's right.
There was no department. There was a Department of Education. There was an Office of Education that basically kept statistics around the country, but it had no authority whatsoever. And that hasn't changed any. But there are people in both parties that think, well, the federal government has an obligation to pay for my college, somehow control the states, and it's not in the Constitution.
Right. And by the way, if the federal government got out of the business of subsidizing college, the cost of college would go down.
There'd be competition. It would go way down. That's right.
The colleges would have to compete on the open market, and you'd end up with some real value in the colleges, and they would reflect the value they offer. It wouldn't be this kind of phony subsidized entity that has overreaching influence. The principle, the active principle in the Constitution is a separation of powers, the system of checks and balances. And it's actually a much more profound idea than simply the three branches of the federal government. It's which balance each other, which check each other. When one exceeds its authority, the other two are supposed to have a legal means of stepping in and limiting that grab for authority. Because the founding fathers understood that power is a tempting thing. It's corrupting. I mean, what is the great quote from George Washington, or was it Jefferson?
So Lord Acton, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Corrupts, but also that the Constitution would have to be, it's a fearful government is a fearful master.
Washington said that government is not force, it is not eloquence, it is a force like fire, a dangerous servant and a fearful master.
And that's right. So they understood that government is essentially, when it comes down to it, it's a necessary evil. We have to have a system in the same way that we create a house with fences and a police entity locally. We have to create a national entity that can only do things that you have to do nationally, like conduct foreign policy and conduct trade policy and other very proscribed powers. But within that context, you have a balance of power. And it's more than just the three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. It's also the balance between the federal government and the states.
That's right.
And then within
the counties, the towns and cities.
Then within the states, you have the same balance. You've got a governor, you've got a state legislature, and you have a state judiciary, and then you have counties, and even a local level, you have cities and towns that maintain balances of power. You've got a mayor or a manager, and then you've got his town committee and a school committee and whatnot. The point is that power in this country, what the genius of this system, both how it's codified in a constitution and also how it's understood in our society, it's a brilliant system in that it diffuses power. It doesn't allow any one power to collect in the hands of any one person or one group. And so you can't have somebody come in and be a dictator. You can't have some group come in and impose their will on other people, and it protects the rights, naturally, of the minority. And I think it was Ayn Rand who pointed out that the most vulnerable of all minorities is the individual. It protects. That's right. And so your rights, and ultimately the separation of power, which includes things like the Second Amendment, the right to keep and own guns and firearms. That's a balance of power idea, because that balances the power of the police power of the federal and state governments. But it ultimately comes down to the great balance of all, which is the balance between the sovereign citizen and the government. That the sovereign citizen, who derives rights from God, or as Jefferson said, the Creator, balances the secular power that they set up to protect rights, which is the state, so that when that secular power, by nature, tries to obtain more power than it's allotted, and that's going to happen because that's human nature, the citizen, the sovereign citizen, balances that power. So it's an idea that it goes beyond just the structure that's put up by the Constitution, which is a brilliant structure. It's something that is observable. It's an ingenious system that protects the imperfect rights of the individual. And it's something that, it didn't just happen overnight. I mean, the founding fathers learned their ideas from from the Anglo-Saxon system in Great Britain, where you had like a sheriff and you had a cleric,
Right.
and then they balanced the power of the king. And it goes back to Roman times. It goes back to ancient Israel, where you had the confederacy of 12 tribes, and they balanced each other out. So it's in the Bible, it's in the Torah, it's in the New Testament.
Founders during the convention, they looked at John Locke, Montesquieu, some French philosophers there. John Locke's Treatise on Government.
Mm-hmm.
They looked at the Bible. They looked at the Old Testament. And so I think there was John Eidsmoe was the constitutional attorney. He broke down how many times they referred to the Bible, how many times they referred to these writings, and quite often. So they didn't just create something. They created something very unique, but they drew from past experiences. And the fact is that we had a king, and we had very little representation, and they didn't want to have a king. And so what they did was that when they created the federal government, they created a Congress, and that's where the power is. This notion that the president is the most powerful man in the free world, well, that's not his job description. You find in the Constitution that the president only has, I think, 8 or 9 powers and duties, very few. Unfortunately, over the past 100 or so years, Congress has been abrogating those powers to the federal government, to the branch, the executive branch, because I think back in Washington's time, I think you had 4 or 5 cabinet officials. You had a secretary of war, secretary of state. I think you had a treasurer. So there's a few. Today, you've got 23. So, that's a big expanse of government right there. And that's the problem. So we need to kind of turn back, declaring war. That's an awesome power. Well, that was handed over to the president in the UN in 1945. One of the things we do as at Camp Constitution, we go out and have information tables at various venues, homeschool shows, gun shows, even on Boston Common and places like that. We have a little 10-question quiz. And the amount of ignorance on the Constitution is really overwhelming. And then we're talking about people who may be college graduates, they may be scientists, engineers, and whatever, great in their fields. And they'll say, gee, I took that in high school, but I forgot. You might go to auto school and you've read your the manual before you got your test, and you may not know how many feet from a hydrant, but instinctively you're too close or too far away. But if you don't understand the Constitution, how do you know when the member of Congress is doing the right thing? How do you know the president's doing the right thing? You have no frame of reference.
I mean, there are a lot of members of Congress who don't understand the Constitution.
And I think they like it that way.
Yeah, and they keep it. You can't find one in a high school. It's a scarce thing.
We were just offered a chance to give constitutions to the 8th grade class in Manchester, New Hampshire, over 1,000. So we're excited about that. So that's the problem. So when you mentioned how do you get a constitutional frame of mind or a constitutional worldview? Well, first is read the Constitution. If you read Article 1 and you read where the House and Senate and their powers and duties, and that's it. I mean, it's almost like this is the contract. When you vote for a member of the House, this is what you're supposed to. You serve these 2-year terms. You're up for election every 2 years, which is a great thing. Frequent elections is one of the hallmarks. And this is your job description. You can raise taxes, but that doesn't mean you should. It's just that you have the power to borrow money. You have the power to. They're all spelled in Article 1, Section 8, and there's about 18 or 19 of them.
That's right.
Everything else.
I mean, Article 1, Section 8 is really the treasure trove of responsibilities for the Congress. And I think if you read that, you suddenly realize that it's not the President of the United States, but it's the Congress that decides anything to do with spending.
That's right.
Anything to do with the budget, anything to do with trade policy. It's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. They basically coin the currency. They're involved in enormous powers that have been usurped. Now, Hal, I know you've done a lot of work over the years on this issue, and because we've talked about things like Common Core curriculum and that what is it, the article, what is that UN local control thing?
The UN Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah, and no, not that, but this thing with their Agenda 21.
Yeah, now it's called Agenda 2030.
They're switching the name. When it starts, when it takes on a certain odor, it's like look, say, reading becomes whole language. But in the overall sense, there's been a trend in this country that I think we could trace back to really the Wilson administration and his election in 1912, where powers that conventionally reside in elected officials who are accountable to the electorate, who have to stand for re-election, and who have powers that are limited by constitutions, are transferred to these unelected experts, these bureaucrats, these entities that have almost sovereign powers. And it was a movement that really started in the early part of the 20th century. Wilson himself wrote about this in a book, in a scholarly book, and that was published, I think, in 1890.
Was it called
when he was a professor? Yeah, probably. I mean, you probably know more about it. There was this guy, his name was Randolph Bourne, who was a philosopher. This guy Crowley. There were some others who, they were Fabian socialists. They were influenced by, socialist movements in Europe, particularly Auguste Comte and others. And they believed that government should be run by so-called experts, not by elected officials, and that these experts would have almost hereditary power to make laws. And I think starting
technocracy, I think that's the new term. Actually, the term goes back to the 20s and 30s. Patrick Wood, the writer author who was a colleague of Anthony Sutton, a younger colleague, wrote recently a book about technocracy, and he said how it really started here in the United States, and it was embraced by the Germans, the Nazis to some extent, aspects.
The Prussians, or it goes back to Prussia. And also, I thought you said kleptocracy. We could say that too.
Well, but kleptocracy, right. That's right, yeah.
But the point is that this trend started to accelerate with the creation. We could get into it, it's a separate subject, but the creation of the Federal Reserve System and other of these entities that transferred power from Congress to these private institutions. And ultimately, of course, after World War II, you had the United Nations, which internationalized this and which then tries to basically legislate. So we don't even have Americans. We have faceless international bureaucrats from places like Somalia making laws about human rights.
That's right.
And it's
monitoring our elections too, by the way.
How so?
The UN monitors some of our elections.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, I don't doubt that. And look, the thing is that they have gotten involved in the most intricate elements of control over things like education, family life, welfare, health issues. The Obamacare nationalized a large part of the health industry. We can look at almost any area of life, and you have a transfer of powers from accountable elected officials who can be impeached and who have to stand for election
or expelled from office.
Or expelled from office, or they have to answer to a constitutional system. They're supposed to operate in public so that everyone knows what they're doing.
It's a great fraction. It's my favorite fraction. It's 2/3. The founders were great. They said that in order to pass a treaty, you need 2/3 of the Senate. In order to expel someone, 2/3 of the House or Senate. In order to have an Article 5 convention, you need 2/3 of the states. 2/3 is a great fraction because they didn't believe in this idea of democracy, the power of the majority, because the whims of the majority could be wrong. So that's why we have that. It makes it very difficult to change the Constitution, to amend it, and it was brilliant. And also the Electoral College, which I was doing a little research on it because I'm doing my radio show a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about it, and I found this website called debate.org. And it looked like only about 13% of these people that are involved in this website believe that we should keep the Electoral College. And I don't know if I didn't know the demographics, if they're all liberal high school kids or what, but that's not a good stat. I mean, we're concerned that they want to change that, and we have to be on guard for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, if we get rid of the Electoral College, then the president will be elected out of New York and Los Angeles.
And Chicago. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it would be there wouldn't be any equal representation. I mean, the Electoral College basically diffuses the power to elect the executive to smaller states and smaller areas like Alaska or Vermont, for that matter.
Well, the problem was the electoral. I was just doing a little research yesterday, kind of refreshing my memory. When they debated how we're going to choose the executive, first off, there was a debate whether it should be one or more than one. Several type executive
Right.
members. And then they thought, but a popular election, and that was really, oh, there's no way we want that, because these states with small populations would have no say. So the
That's
Electoral
right.
College was, I think, a brilliant device.
Right, and it basically allows for an equal, so you have different diverse regions of the country which have different interests. You have farm belt, you've got mountain states, you've got seafaring states. I mean, people have the regions. The South is different, so therefore everyone gets, at least in an imperfect sense, everybody has a say in who is going to be the president. But we now have, of course, a president, Donald J., who, as imperfect a person as he is, if you read his inaugural address, it is one of the most brilliant documents that should be read by every high school kid, because he talks about transferring power away from this, what has come to be known as the deep state, the swamp. There's different euphemisms, and returning it to the sovereign people, and he's very explicit about that. And I think that he has actually moved in that direction. It's almost a miracle when you look at it. I mean, every one of his cabinet agencies has moved to transfer powers gradually back to the people. I mean, I could give you one example. The Department of the Interior, Ryan Zinke, he is now talking about moving the Department of the Interior out of Washington and setting it up in about 10 different parts of the country, so that it's closer to people who actually can have a say then in how the environment is conducted. Now, look, ideally, we'd like to see all of it return to the states, but nevertheless, this is an extraordinary move in the direction of, returning power to the people. And we could look at I think just about every agency of his government is doing this. And this is why he is under attack. This is why the viciousness and the hatred and the shrillness of the attack he's under, not just by liberals, not just by Democrats, but by the establishment Republicans,
I think
the internationalists. I know they do. I mean, they're the ones that talk about that. But
he has a reoccurring theme. The speech he gave in Davos there, an entity which I dislike very much, by the way, the World Economic Forum, also was his inaugural address, too. He said that we put the interests of the American people first. And he said, America's open for business. You want to come here and make stuff, build stuff, come here and hire our people. I haven't heard a president say that. I don't know if in my lifetime. I'm almost 59.
It's amazing. I know.
Refreshing. Some UN official took.
He went there and he poked his finger right in the eye of the internationalists, and he said, I'm here to talk about American interests. And by the way, you as heads of state of your respective countries should focus on your national interests too. I mean, what a great message, I
mean, you look at the Chancellor of Germany allowing an unlimited amount of people from a
million
culture into your country. Is that in the best interest of your country? I don't think
it's insane. No, there's over 1 million Muslim immigrants in Germany now.
It's this international community. The international community comes first. It came first with Obama, with both Bushes. It came first. Reagan, maybe not as much, but still. But definitely Daddy Bush, when he said New World Order, that's their mindset. And
I think that we're seeing some extraordinary changes. I mean, the tax bill was basically repatriation of corporate tax, cutting corporate taxes, which allows currencies, money that had been held overseas, to come back in the United States for investment. And it's the results have been fantastic, and it's going to continue to be. And the Democrats and the liberals are just going berserk. They're actually talking. I mean, you have Nancy Pelosi refer to these bonuses as crumbs. I mean, what these are supposed to be champions of the working people. I think that they have nothing more to say. So they've finally resorted, or they're resorting to the worst possible last resort, which is to try to claim that Donald Trump has something against black men and women. And that's being put to the lie also, because black unemployment is the lowest record level it's been probably in history. And, I think people are starting to hopefully wake up and see that these policies, which are pro-American, they transcend Trump. It's a movement, and that it's an opportunity to educate people with regard to the importance of that movement and how that movement is going to really set not only us free as individuals, but unleash the enormous engine that this country has of creativity and invention and accomplishment.
Well, it's interesting. The racist charge, they throw that out against a lot of people. But
oh, yeah, of course. It's standard.
To do a little research, I actually found a video of Donald Trump. He was a championship fight took place at his hotel in New Jersey, Michael Spinks and Mike Tyson. And he was in the ring, introduced. Everyone was well-wishing him, shaking hands with Muhammad Ali and Michael Tyson and Michael Spinks and Don King and these other mostly black people in that ring.
And by the way, Jesse Jackson was there.
And,
Did you see that?
Not only that, in 1999, I have a little video. I said Donald Trump at a Klan rally, and there he is. In 1999, he gets an award from Jesse Jackson for hiring minorities.
Yes.
So all of a sudden, because he says we should, and I don't think we need a wall from the whole Mexican border. I think there's probably choke points where we need, a wall. But the fact is, we want to secure our country. Who loses jobs when unskilled laborers come in? It's usually the poor blacks are the first ones to suffer. And these
and they realize it. I was listening the other day to a black radio talk show on Urban Network at Sirius XM, and caller after caller and the host was saying that they're against the amnesty because they realize that black unemployment is at an all-time low, wages are up, the bonuses are there, opportunity is entering into the cities, and to have an influx of foreigners being a citizen, that's going to reduce the value of labor. Now, look, labor, individuals are not a commodity. We are individuals, but labor is a commodity.
Right.
And it's like any other commodity, it's a supply and demand. And if you have more supply, then value goes down. I mean, that's just that's how the market works. And that's why people like the Koch brothers and the National Chambers of Commerce and other people that we generally think of as on the so-called right, that's why they're in favor of amnesty. That's why they want open borders, because they want cheap labor. And so they join with the socialists who want to have no borders and who want to merge the United States, become an ant colony in a province of the world. They kind of form this unholy alliance. And the result is that American workers and American labor and American industry is screwed. American labor, they've worked for a century to develop a standard of living and to develop certain standards. And all of that is thrown out the window when you have a huge influx of foreign labor.
That's correct.
So, Hal, anyway, I want you to, before we end the broadcast, I'd like you to, again, let my listeners know, let my viewers know in this case, how they can get in touch with you, how they can find out more information about Camp Constitution.
Well, you can go to our website, campconstitution.net, and there you can access our YouTube channel. You can leave us a message and say, hey, I'd like to be contacted. I'd like to host a speaker. I'd like to go to camp or what have you. I'd like to start a camp in this area. And if you want to access the Sam Bluevin the archives, just go to the button. You'll see the drop down. And all we need is an email, and it's all free. So that's my recommendation.
Oh, excellent. All right. Listen, Hal, I think it's been a great broadcast. I hope to really get this thing up and running so that I can interview people that I've been waiting and wanting to interview for a long time, live with the split screen. I'm really excited about that. And again, I want to thank you for joining me.
All right. Thanks for having me, Chuck. God bless.
All right. God bless. And thanks so much. And I shall return, God willing, tomorrow, 12 noon. Have a good day, everybody.